For 90 years, Crimson Dawn has held the Midsummer's Eve Festival to celebrate the summer solstice and to share the stories of Neal Forsling and her characters. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we can't be together at Crimson Dawn this year. However, we have taken this opportunity to create for you a virtual Midsummer's Eve event with all of Neal's characters, shrines, and solstice stories. So pour yourself some hot chocolate and get a plate of cookies. Sit back and relax as our storyteller, Rebekah Hunt, takes us on a journey through the magical land of Crimson Dawn.
Hello, I'm Rebekah Hunt, and I'm here tonight to give you an alternate version of our annual Midsummer's Eve celebration here at Crimson Dawn. This was Neal Forsling's first cabin. Neal was born Elizabeth Paxton in 1889 in Independence, Missouri. She grew up with 3 siblings in a household. Her father was an attorney, and her mother was a genteel young woman who died of tuberculosis when Neal was a teenager. Neal grew up very artistic. She was always painting, she was writing poetry. When she was in her 30s, she finally decided maybe it was time to settle down, and she went to a sanitarium in Wisconsin and met a young Don Ogilvy. Because this was just about the time of the start of World War I, they had a rather whirlwind romance and married just as he was shipping off to France. Their first daughter, Mary, was born in 1919. When he came back, he decided to come up to Casper, Wyoming to start his law practice. And so he and Elizabeth moved up here. And it was during the 20s that she took on a pen name, Neal Gallatin. Neal was her mother's middle name, and Gallatin was her father's. And that became not only her writing name, but over time she replaced Elizabeth entirely with Neal. She and Don were married for a few years. They had another daughter, Jean, in 1920, and then the marriage fell apart for a variety of reasons. And in 1929 they divorced, and that was the year that Neal came up to the mountain for the first time, saw Crimson Dawn, literally walked out of the forest into the light and the green and the red, and felt she'd walked out into some kind of primeval ocean and was just enchanted. She immediately called it Crimson Dawn, found out that it was available to homestead. She was supposed to be temporary, maybe for a season or two. This was her home for the rest of her life. She moved up here with her 9-year-old and 11-year-old daughters. She came with her belongings, 2 dogs, and they, over the summer, acquired 2 girls who were their friends' daughters for the summer. So they had 4 girls, Neal, 2 dogs, and a sickly cat, all living in the cabin as it was built at the time. And what I'm standing in now is that cabin. Good days, bad days, rainy days, muddy days, they were here. And so Neal started telling the girls stories about these magical beings who lived on the mountain. In about 1930-31, she met Jim Forsling. Eventually they would marry, and she would become more or less of a regular summer and winter inhabitant up here. As we go through this door, what we'll be doing is moving into the cabin as it evolved. I'm walking out of Neal's original cabin. This is the vestibule between the old cabin, which was built by Neal's folkstead, and Neal's new cabin. This was the second edition, or the second part of the cabin built in the 1930s. One of the things that Neal did after she spent her first winter up here was she wrote a short story about it. And her brother, who at that time worked for H.L. Mencken at the Mercury magazine, pitched her story to Mencken. So he paid her $300, and she and Jim Forsling, her husband, sold logs, cut logs, used the money to build this extension of the cabin. So instead of that being everything This became their kitchen, their dining room, their living room, and it really doubled their space. And then you have the newspaper article from March of 1942 showing Jim's death. He'd gone to town, he was buying groceries, bringing them in, stopped at his friend Ole Fogsted's house for warming up and maybe a couple of drinks. And in the middle of the blizzard that came up during the night, he decided he needed to get home to Neal. And so he went out on his skis in the early morning, and the blizzard got worse and worse, and he got almost over here to home when he collapsed under a tree and froze to death. Neal was devastated, went out looking. They eventually found his body, and she wrote some very poignant poetry about what it means to lose the man you love. Right now I am moving from the second part of the cabin, first edition, to this, which is of course now the living room and the art gallery. This was Neal's edition in the 1950s. After she had worked at the Army Air Base in World War II and traveled some, she came back here. She decided she needed a studio. She had some friends design this and some other friends help her build it. She filled it with her paintings of the mountain witches, of Wyoming scenes, and even places she traveled. She then would sell things when people came in. She also painted plates with wildflowers and Wyoming scenes. One of the things that Neal tended to do was take pieces of her creativity, like her mountain stories, and turn them into something that might be for sale. So you see here there's a plaque, and it has all of the 7 witches that she created on it. She not only did these plaques for sale, but she would do little individual images that someone could buy and wear as a lapel pin. Neal collected items she found all over this end of the mountain. So in the case, there's things that were left by soldiers marching through down in the valley, because that was a main path. There's projectile points from First Nations in the little case here, and some down in the case here. Even interesting bits of driftwood. So, you know, this became a place that was a way to sort of engage her creativity, but also make a little extra money. So, just as a little background, when any of you who haven't been to Midsummer's Eve wouldn't know this, but everyone else would, Neal had magic rings that she always wore. They were rings of power that had been given her by the Cardinal Witch, and the start of the whole night was to stand out at the end of the trail here, tap the rings 3 times together, and that started the whole evening. Neal didn't have quite so much pomp and circumstance going on when she did her first Midsummer's Eve. In 1929, when she saw this property, she was astounded at how beautiful it was. She talked about walking out of the trees and seeing the red earth and the grasses, and it looked like she was standing on the edge of a magical land here. When Neal actually came to her homestead with the girls, she decided that she wanted to do something for the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. She said, well, I could do a cairn. The sheep herders do cairns, that's appropriate, but it's not quite right. It's not quite what I want. And so she gathered some stones and built a very small version of Stonehenge on the edge of the butte. And she said, this is going to commemorate this longest day of the year in the way that the ancient people in Europe did. And then each year she also, with the girls, would do some kind of a fire. She had her first public Midsummer's Eve where she invited about a dozen friends, mostly mountain people, in 1931, and did the bonfire then. And she said that that was when she started the tradition of throwing something into the fire and making a wish. For a while they did the sticks in the fire. And then eventually, certainly by the 1950s, probably 1940s, they come up with throwing a handful of red earth in. And then she changed the tradition a little bit and said, well, in fact, one person in each year will get their wish from throwing the earth in the fire. In 1951, Warren Weaver wished for a wife. He'd had very bad luck finding someone to marry him, and he was in his late 20s. He thought he was getting kind of over the hill. And that night as he was leaving, there'd been some rain, he found two young women stuck in a mud puddle going out towards the main road. One of them was Neal's daughter Jean, but there was this other young woman named Sarah Bowron. And my dad got him out of the mud puddle, and a week later my folks were married. That was the wish for 1951. Now what we're going to do is we're going to walk down the path from where we started along what used to be the original road to come into Crimson Dawn, and we're going down to the Topaz Gate. The Topaz Gate is the entrance to this magical land. It is the region that is governed by the Topaz Witch. In the center of the painting behind me, there's a young woman with flowing golden hair and a golden robe and a golden hat. And sitting next to her is a woman in red. Those two are sisters. The woman in red is Cardinal and the woman in gold is Topaz. They both come from Italy from about 191 CE, so almost 2,000 years ago. They were part of the larger Strega community in Italy. Cardinal chose to be a leader of witches and eventually brought that here and led the witches here. Topaz took another route, and she wanted to be domestic, and she wanted to be married, and she wanted to have children. And so she stepped a bit away from the traditional roles that she would have had. And she married a loving and kind and gentle king, and eventually they had twin boys, and they were incredibly happy together. And then the king died suddenly, and shortly thereafter her two little boys died. She was bereft. She didn't want to be anywhere near where she'd been living. She didn't want to be reminded of all she'd lost. So her sister invited Topaz to come to Casper Mountain and live in the Topaz land and to guard the Topaz Gate on the mountain. That is why we are now standing here in front of Topaz. She is going to let you through into the land, and so pay your respects to Topaz as you go by. She might give you a little token, and then once we have said farewell to her, we'll move on. As we walk around the corner here, you'll notice a log enclosure. Inside on the ground you see a large star, and everything is sparkly and shiny. And there's a young woman with flowing white blonde hair, and she's walking around and she's laughing and she's throwing sparkles, fairy dust on people. She especially likes to pick out people with blonde hair or gray hair or white hair. But she will pretty much equally put the sparkles on anybody. What you don't know if you ask her to do that is she is bewitching you. And if she wants, she can use that to put you to sleep for 100 years in the forest. Or she can make you sleep for an afternoon and you wake up and you never know what's happened. So beware, she's a bit of a trickster. She's a bit of a unpredictable character. She's the youngest of the witches. Her best friend is the oldest of the witches, who is Emerald. As you walk down the trail after you've been at the Star Witch Shrine, then you eventually come to a tree in the middle of an enclosure, and for some reason the tree is surrounded by whiskey bottles and wine bottles and brandy bottles. And if you look really close, you see that sitting in the corner there's a little man in a green suit. And once you notice him, you realize that you are looking at a leprechaun. And people can usually get their heads around the idea of a bunch of witches who live here, and there's some other creatures you'll hear about. But basically, the leprechaun is on the mountain because Neal, when she had just the one room, and then when she had 2 rooms, before she had this space, realized that she was never going to be able to really get her head around being a housekeeper. And that she needed somebody who would come in and who would keep house for her. And she realized that having a human was probably not a really great idea. So she sent the word out, and the first one she contacted was a Norwegian troll. And trolls are well known, believe it or not, for being pretty good housekeepers. Elves can do it too, but elves can be a little flighty. And the troll asked her a few questions, and he said, no, I only really clean for people who are already pretty kind of neat and clean anyway. So then she went on a little bit further, kind of trying to send the word out through the magic channels, which he was looking for. And Sean the leprechaun contacted her, and he said, oh, begosh and begorra, I am certainly able to do your cleaning. I am, after all, a leprechaun. And she said, yes, but are you reliable? Are you steady? And he says, oh, begosh and begorra, of course, I will always be there when you need me, but what do you need? Well, I need sweeping, and I need dishwashing, and I need some laundry. And he said, oh, I don't know about that, you know. Begosh and begorra, that seems like a lot of work, but I'll do my best, And so she said, okay, come. And the first week was pretty good. He swept, and he mopped, and he did some dishes, and then the next day he was gone about a day. And then the next week he was gone 2 days, and so on. And she realized that he was not going to be there to do much of that work. She also noticed that when she went out in the woods, she would find a little pile of bottles here and a little pile of bottles there. And she realized that what he'd done was he'd just kind of gone back to the, gosh and begorra, I'm a leprechaun, what do you expect of me, I drink. So she quit depending on him and kind of did the cleaning up herself from that point on. And of course, when Jim came to live with her, you know, he was pretty good at that. Although I have to say, Jim drank. She nonetheless eventually got him to kind of pare down the bottles in 1 or 2 areas, so it wasn't quite such a mess. And there were places on the mountain that miners had dumped their cans and their bottles, and whenever possible, she said, oh, just add it to that litter over there, it's going to be okay. Sean is here and there, and you see him, but he's usually got his bottle of Jameson there with him wherever you see him. So well, then you walk a little bit further down the path. There's a place where there's the Phantom Woodchopper. And the Phantom Woodchopper is a character who is out and cuts in the forest. And Neal was quite concerned about that at first, because she and Jim made their living by cutting logs for cabins and fence poles and those sorts of things. And they didn't want someone else coming in and stealing their wood. But every time she would go to confront him, she'd see like a little puff of mist, and she'd no longer hear chopping, and there'd be no one there. And then a few minutes later, she'd hear it a little further off in the woods, and then a little further off in the woods. And it took her a long time to finally sneak up on him efficiently enough to catch him. And then, of course, once you caught him, he can no longer hide from you. So he agreed that he would keep his wood chopping to a certain kind of thing. He said, but I have to stay on the mountain. I can't leave the mountain. I'm in love. And I'm in love with the Moon Maiden. And she only comes down to see me on this mountain. And so occasionally you will see the Moon Maiden coming down and holding court. And she comes down when the sky is clear and the moon is full, and she slides down on a moonbeam, and they spend their evening until the dawn's light comes, and then he doesn't get to see her for another month. But maybe it's more than a month. What if the sky's cloudy? Well, there's so many things that could happen. So it's really not a love with good prospects, but he's refusing to give up on it. So he's still here. And occasionally you can hear the sound of the wood chopping and the mists in the woods. We keep walking along and we come to a shrine to the Good Brother. Neal was one of 4 children born to the Paxton family. She was born in 1889, and she had a younger brother whose name was Edward, and he was probably the only one in a lot of ways who understood why she would go off and live on top of a mountain in Wyoming. And he was a journalist. In fact, he's the one who got her the connection to H.L. Mencken so she could sell her story. And Mencken had said, "Oh, I want to talk to her. This sounds very interesting." And her brother had said, "Yes, but her spelling is atrocious, and I don't know how she could possibly write a good enough story. Just let me handle that. I want to see the story." And he bought the story. But her brother did support her. But unfortunately, her brother died young. He died when he was in his 40s, and Neal was devastated. And so she decided to build a shrine in the woods that was the shrine to the Good Brother. And whenever she was feeling sad, alone, she would take a rock and she would put it in a pile at this shrine. And what it would do is it would give her a chance to sit and think about not the sadness of losing her brother, but all the other things that were happy memories and the things that made her glad that he'd been in her life. And we have had a number of people over the years who have lost someone and who brought a rock or had a rock placed there to remember someone who they lost. And a couple of years ago, I actually lost my younger brother, who was very dear to me, on my behalf and on my sister-in-law's behalf. The character, the man who plays the Good Brother, put a rock in there for us. I might add that the man who plays the Good Brother is Dave Martin, and Dave is actually Neal's grandson. So we have family involved in this as well. Neal had 2 dogs who lived with her. One had come up from town and was, I think, an Irish setter. When the old sheepdog died, she decided to do what people did in English manor houses and in some of the manor houses in Virginia where her father's family had come from. And she built a cemetery for the dog. And it was an enclosed space, and she put a grave in, and she put rocks around the grave. And then eventually, when the other dog died, much later, she did a grave for that. And over time, people on the mountain have brought their pets, and they have buried their pets in the cemetery. And so it's now a full graveyard for animals of the mountain people. And when you walk around, there is a poem on there that talks about the importance of pet dogs, especially in people's lives. Now you'll notice that there's a black tin statue of a dog. That dog is a very special dog. His name was Sherpa. And Sherpa was a war dog. Germans took him to Korea with them, gave him to the Japanese. When the Japanese left Korea, they left the dog there. My Uncle Wayne Weaver, my dad's twin brother, who was stationed there, found the dog, took care of him, and brought him back. And then when Uncle Wayne went off to college, he left the dog with my father. My father, after the war, was a Zen Buddhist vegetarian. He took care of the dog, and one time my dad he'd been doing some work for Neal over here and was going back to the other side of the mountain, and the road through Bear Trap was still a dirt road. It had some sandy spots. And he got stuck in the sand, and he jacked up his truck to dig himself out. He was under the truck digging with his shovel when the jack slipped and the truck came down on top of him. The dog climbed out of the truck, dug my father out, and saved his life. The dog ate steak for a week, even from a vegetarian owner. So he was a very special dog. And when he died a little bit later, Neal had my parents bury him in the cemetery. And then my father built that statue out of 50-gallon oil drums. And so that's one of 2 big metal statues in the park. As we continue our walk down the path, I want to show you the witch you see in the middle talking to Topaz in the light sea green robes, long fair hair. What you can't really tell in that painting is that her hat is decorated with seashells. Undine has a rather unusual story. You can see in the shrine, when you see her shrine, that it's studded with seashells of all kinds. And Undine is another term for a sea witch from Pacific Coast. And she used to, in the summer night, she would go out and she would dance in the moonlight on the sand, and her robes would flow, and she had kind of a sheen to her because she was a sea witch. And one night during World War II, as she was dancing on the shore, a flyer from a nearby Army Air Base in California saw her, and he was enchanted, and he circled her once, and he circled her twice, and he circled her 3 times. And because he was training in a seaplane, he put down in the water, sort of glided up gently to the beach, and stepped out, and she was entranced because here was this great bird with a human who had stepped out of it, and he started to talk to her, and he told her how beautiful she was, and he told her how interesting she was, and was there anything she would like? And she said, I would like to go flying in your big bird with you. And so he said, okay, we will do that. And he put her in the plane, and they took off, and they flew up over the ocean, and then he started turning inward because he actually was going back to his base, which was the Casper Army Air Base out at what is now the airport. And he had no intention of letting her go. And so they flew and flew, and they flew long, and they flew high, and her feet got cold. And he said, well, here, put on my moccasins, put on my wool socks. So she took off her slippers, which were her magical slippers. When she took them off, it broke some of her enchantment. And as they were flying over the west end of Casper Mountain, she fell out, and she tumbled to the ground, and she lay there. And then she got up and looked around, and she realized that she was far away from her ocean. And she began to cry and wail and weep. And when that happened, the mist started to rise. Pretty soon, she's crying, and it's in the winds, and all the other witches were alarmed because they'd never run into her before. So they told Cardinal, and Cardinal says, well, bring her over here closer to where we are. We can take care of her. And they made her a little place to live, and they brought her shells, and all of a sudden they noticed that seagulls were starting to come, and they were coming to comfort her as well. And they would bring her shells, and they would bring her seaweed, and it gave her some hope. But she realized after a time that she was never going to get back to her ocean. And so she's a very sad, sad creature. And sometimes she dances a little bit in the woods, and the mists come up. When I was a child, I would walk in the woods on a dark night, and especially for some reason in the wintertime, the mists would roll in and they would smell of the sea. So I knew that Undine was unhappy, and she was crying. We're going to continue our walk across the road, down the path. We're walking close to another log cabin. That was actually considered the line shack, or the place when Neal and Jim might have some people up here working for them. That would be the bunk house. When we come back around at the end of the evening, in the traditional live Midsummer's Eve, that's where Bob Shepard and his crew, Bob Shepard used to have the A&W on CY, where they will have cocoa and coffee. So you can see that cabin and you know where you're coming to in the end. Next year when we're back, coffee and cookies for everyone. And now as we come around the corner, you see a very large enclosure. And if you notice on the trees around it, they're all covered with purple flowers of all kinds. And you notice that there's 2 creatures inside the enclosure. The first one you're likely to encounter is a beautiful woman who you can see dancing in the rocks with bright red hair, and that is the Lavender Witch. She is the mistress of this whole sort of section of Crimson Dawn. It's a section of darker trees with open glades. Lavender is the one who is responsible also for any of the purple or blue flowers you would see out and about. So Lavender presents people with flowers as you come to her shrine. She also, though, has a very special responsibility, and she is the one who helps keep track of and care for the other creature you see, and that is Vermilion. He doesn't really say too much, but you often see him covered in bits of mud, porcupine quills or pine cones in his hair. He wears rusty robes, chains. We're not really sure where he came from, but the enchantment that captured him placed him on Casper Mountain. He is very interested in people. He's pretty good at hearing questions. He's pretty good at giving you directions. And sometimes he doesn't give you directions you know you want. So for instance, he will come up and he will look closely at you and he will count on his fingers, or he will count on pine needles. And then he will say, 5 miles that way, or 4 miles that way. And you know that something you have to do is going to be that way or that way. You're going to notice that there is a little better light. You've been in the pine forest, it's been kind of dark, and we're sort of angling a little bit towards sunset, but you're starting to see some slightly more shimmering light out there. You come to a point on the trail where when you look up, standing on sort of a tall platform, is a woman dressed all in green, who is the Emerald Witch. She is the oldest of the witches. She has been in competition with the Cardinal Witch for all the years they have been up here on the mountain. She very much resents the power that the Cardinal Witch has, and she also, because she loves anything green, so you notice there's peacock feathers, she likes green gems, and the Cardinal Witch has some very special, important green gems that are part of her magic, and Emerald wants those so much. And right up here on the mantle, you can see there's a little cup, and hidden in that cup, and Emerald doesn't know they're there, are the 7 magical green stones. They're here because Cardinal gave them to Neal for safekeeping. And so each separate person who is the storyteller is responsible for those magical stones. When Neal no longer told the stories, it was her daughter Jean, and when Jean died and was buried on the Red Butte, then her sister Mary took up that. And then in 1991, they passed that responsibility and the green stones to me. I think Emerald maybe guesses that I have them, but there's no way she can take them away from me. So there's this kind of tension underlines some of what's going on among the 7 witches on the mountain. We're going to walk a little bit further down the trail here. What you're going to find now is what we call Bambi's Rock Castle. And this is the shrine that my generation helped build. We have lots of deer on the mountain, and there's bucks, there's does, there's fawns. We also have hunting on parts of the mountain. And sometimes people are not always careful about where they're hunting, or, you don't hunt does in the season when they're having their babies, for instance, and you don't hunt on private land. There was an incident back in the 1960s where a mother deer was killed and the fawn was left orphaned. There's actually 3 little elves who live in the caverns underneath Crimson Dawn. And so what they did was they came to Neal and said, could you have the children build a door? And it looks kind of like a stone castle, but the idea is it's enchanted, and if there's ever an animal endangered, they can come to that, the door opens, and they go down into the underground realm to be protected until it's safe to come out. So that's what Bambi's Rock Castle is. That was the shrine that the children made to help the animals. Neal, by the way, never let people hunt on her land. That was one of her absolute inflexible rules. Here we are at a very special place. If you look at the picture up here, you see a witch in a black dress with a cane with blue fringe on her dress. She is the Black Witch. She is probably the one who looks most like most people would expect a witch to look. She's kind of old and she's got, a wart on her nose, kind of like I do, and she looks like she could be pretty scary. But she's a really good example of don't judge people by how they look. She is actually one of the nicest, kindest witches in the forest. She is always making up potions, always making up concoctions, always doing a little bit of magic, but it's not the kind of magic that's going to hurt anyone. And if you are a child coming to Midsummer's Eve, you might find that what you're going to get from her might be a bottle of enchanted bubbles or an enchanted lollipop. And they won't do anything bad for you. It's something she does because she really likes the children. The really interesting thing about Wyoming is that we have a tendency to let people be who they are, to not give them a lot of grief about who they are. And understanding the Black Witch is really important to understanding how accepting people in Wyoming can be. This next shrine is one that Neal built for herself. As Neal lived here, being a poet and an artist, she was always creating. And if you noticed when we were seeing the bedroom, the first cabin and the second cabin, over the windows there were sayings written. After 3 days, fish and guests start to smell, throw them out. There's another one that says, in the marketplace there is money, under the pine trees there is peace. I told you a little bit about how hard it was in the early days living in one room with 2 girls, 4 girls and all. She finally decided to go make a place out in the woods for herself that she could go and have some peace. And so she did Neal's secret shrine. It's rocks in the shape of a comet. So there's a circle and there's 3 tails coming off of it. And it was a place where she could just go, breathe in the quiet. The girls knew they weren't going to come and bother her. They knew they were going to give her a little alone time. The sign that accompanies that shrine now is Neal's phrase about the marketplace and the pine trees. And that's one of the reasons it's painted here in the house. It's because that meant a great deal to her. As we walk a little bit further along, you see a pine tree. You see in the middle of the enclosure around the pine tree lots and lots and lots of pine needles and the little flakes from pine cones. And then you see a sculpture of a large-sized pine cone. sitting in there. And 3 years ago, one of our artistic women on the mountain created that pine cone for that shrine. The story behind that shrine is it's called the Squirrel Capital. Neal had a really good friend, Bess, who lived next door to her in Independence, Missouri. And when Bess got married, she married a man named Harry Truman, who became first vice president for Franklin Roosevelt, and then president when Roosevelt died unexpectedly in office. So her friend became First Lady of the United States. And they would correspond, and they would, they'd talk to each other. When the Trumans were campaigning, they came through Casper, and Neal actually rode with them on the train for a while. And when Harry Truman was running for another term, he was running against a man named Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower was, of course, the greatest World War II general. He was a very important general, and he won the election. Well, when he went to the White House, he loved to golf. Eisenhower loved to golf. And he would go out and putt around on the lawn of the White House. And the squirrels would have to run and hide because they might get hit by golf balls. So the squirrels sent a delegation to Neal on Casper Mountain and said, "Do you have anywhere out here where nobody plays golf and where we can have a safe place to have our own life and our own government?" And she said, "Sure, come to Crimson Dawn, no problem." And so they built a squirrel capital of the United States up on Crimson Dawn. And one of the squirrels said to her, "We like it a lot better here. There's way too many nuts in Washington." We're going to walk down and around this long curving path, and at the end of the path you are going to find the Tin Owl. The Tin Owl is really something out of Neal's childhood. She grew up in a lawyer's family in Independence, Missouri. Her father had a partner named Edward Rose, and Mr. Rose was a good lawyer, but I suspect he would really probably rather have been doing something else with his life, because among other things, he spent a lot of time telling the children stories and eventually compiled all those stories into a book for children. Mr. Rose's stories were about a tin owl who, instead of eating mice as normal owls would, ate brass tacks and got into adventures. So what you see here is the shrine to the Tin Owl, which for Neal was very important because it was a remembrance of her childhood, but it was also something to remind her daughters that there's a lot of magical stories in the world, and that books are one of your passages into those magical stories. You will also notice that there is a large tin owl in the shrine. That again is the work of Warren Weaver. It is another 55-gallon oil drum, and in Natrona County we do have access to a lot of old oil drums. It is something that he created for Neal for the shrine. When Neal was living up here with the girls, mostly the girls weren't up here in the wintertime because it's very hard, they're very far from the road. So they spent their winters in Manitou Springs with their father's family and went to school, and then eventually went to college in Colorado. And then they would come up here for the summertime. A lot of the building shrines, certainly the Midsummer's Eve celebrations, all revolved around when the girls were able to be on the mountain for the summer. Neal often had help from her daughters and a few other mountain people to build the shrines. She also let the girls do their own, and even when the next generation came around, the younger generation also got to do some shrines as well. So what you see is really a three-generational process of remembering all the stories. So the next shrine is one that Jean and Mary. I think maybe even Gloria and Nancy might have had a hand in. And it was called Heart's Desire. And it's a ring of rocks that are in the shape of a heart. And the idea was that the girls or their friends could walk in there, they'd walk in one direction, in another direction, and then they would kneel on a stone at the top of the heart and put their hand over their heart, and they would say what they wished for, maybe in a boyfriend or a husband, or they would ask for sort of guidance on who they should be looking for, what they should be doing. Heart's Desire was one of those very important shrines for that younger generation. Every year, there are people who, as our group is walking by, someone will come back and they'll do the ritual and they'll kneel down. So it's something that still resonates with people. We're going to wind the trail, we're going to wind back in, and we're going to finally come to a place where you see 3 little creatures. Remember I mentioned that there are 3 elves who live on this mountain. Their names are Branch, Root, Twig. Their job is to do a couple of things. They're the messengers from the Cardinal Witch to all the other creatures within this magic land. They will tell them when the Cardinal Witch needs them for a meeting or when they need to know something. But they also go in those cabins under all of this forest, and they're the ones who, with their big silver shears, will trim tree roots and help make sure there's some open parks and open spaces that are not covered over by pine trees. They're part of the natural system of the mountain. Normally they live in the caverns under Crimson Dawn. When they travel around above ground, you can see there is a stag behind them. And you notice he's made of wood. He will come alive when they need to ride, take them wherever they need to go. We're going to go up the end of the butte, and we're going to pass a place that's called the Truth Pond. Now this is not the original Truth Pond, this is the second Truth Pond. The original one was across the road, and it was a place where there was always beautiful sparkling water, and the wild horses and other kind of creatures always came to drink there. But when all the shrines moved here, they created the Truth Pond at a place where Neal and Jim had been working on building themselves a pond. The Truth Pond is very interesting. If you are likely to stretch the truth a little bit, never, ever, ever put your finger in the Truth Pond. Because if you get even the littlest drop of that water on your hand, then you are required by magic to tell the truth for the rest of your life. Now, I know all of us as children were teased and challenged by our friends and our siblings to put our fingers in there. And I actually put mine in one time. And that is how you know, for instance, that every single story I've told you tonight is the absolute truth. Because I am unable to tell anything but the truth because of having the water of the Truth Pond on my fingers. Now, the thing we've always also done is whenever we know someone's running for office, for instance in Wyoming, or even on a national level, people will invite them to come to Crimson Dawn and put their hand or the tip of their finger into the Truth Pond. But you know, it's kind of interesting. Very, very few politicians have ever been willing to take the risk of having to tell the truth for the rest of their lives, so they don't come to the Truth Pond. We only have 2 more stops before we're at the end of our journey on Midsummer's Eve at Crimson Dawn. As we walk along the edge of the butte here, you'll notice how red the earth is. And what we're doing is we're getting almost right over the roof of the cardinal's house inside the butte. And as we come down over the edge, you are going to be seeing two figures sitting right on the edge of the butte, facing out towards Muddy Mountain. What you're going to be seeing is the Cardinal Witch, who is Topaz's sister, and of course she's also the head witch here at Crimson Dawn. She is very, very old. She came to Crimson Dawn from the year 191. She is very wise, and she's very connected into the whole world. So she keeps track of what's happening in most places around the world, and then she can communicate to witches who are sort of looking over their own countries a bit, to tell them what she has seen so that maybe they can head off some kind of trouble. She's lived for generations and generations and years in the Red Butte. It's lined all the way around with crystal like mirrors, but she can see through and into other places in those mirrors. You might think that this was a very lonely existence, and on some levels it is, because it's one of very great responsibility. But she has a companion, the other figure that you see here, and in fact, I'm going to stop for a second and let you hear some faint, ethereal music. That is being played by the Cardinal Witch's companion, who is the blind minstrel. The blind minstrel was a traveling minstrel in the Middle Ages in Europe, and he went from kingdom to kingdom and told stories and played songs, and earned his keep while he was in that kingdom. But then he came to a kingdom where the monarch was so entranced with his storytelling and with his music that he decided he simply was not going to let him go. And the minstrel says, "No, I'm a wandering minstrel. I have to go on, I have to go on." The king said no, and he blinded him. And when the Cardinal Witch saw this, in one of her mirrors, she brought him to her in the Crystal Cavern, and he has lived with her here on Casper Mountain for all that time. He plays music and he keeps her company. And the interesting thing about his music, and you may be hearing it today, people who don't know for sure what they're hearing will hear the notes. But sometimes they think it's the wind, and if you listen, the wind, but you can also hear in it the notes of the blind minstrel's heart. Bow down in farewell to the cardinal and to the blind minstrel. Then we're going to walk along the top of the butte and take in the scenery. And you know, a number of times as we've done this, the full moon has come out, comes up over Muddy Mountain, and you get this beautiful full moon shining on you as you're walking between the Cardinal and our next stop. Or the mists will roll over and you'll feel the moisture, and maybe you'll even smell sea salt, and you know that Undine is unhappy. Eventually, you will be at a small cemetery, and people always say, why on earth is there a cemetery on top of this Red Butte? And then when you come around to the end and look at the graves, you realize that there are 4 graves in that cemetery. One is Neal's, one is that of Geoff Forsling, her husband, one is her daughter Jean, and the other one is Jean's husband, Ray Loomis, whose family had a cabin just over the backside of the Red Butte, and the two families were very close friends. And when Jean came back from being in the Air Force for many years, she was reacquainted with Ray, who was a childhood friend, and they married. So, Phil Pike, you've been involved in Crimson Dawn activities and Midsummer's Eve for how many years now?
I think, I want to say 15 years.
So you're an old timer.
Apparently.
And you've been the blind minstrel pretty much all that time?
Yeah, pretty much the entire time. I got a frantic phone call one day. My kids had been the branch, root, and twig one year, and they said, our blind minstrel can't show up, can you do the part? And I'm like, oh, okay. So,
did you know how to play an auto harp at that point?
No, never even seen an auto harp.
So you had to learn that bit as well.
Yeah.
So once a year, you show up as a blind minstrel.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do anything else with Crimson Dawn or Midsummer's Eve?
Well, I've been the sitting president with the group for, I want to say 8 years.
Okay.
So I help to...
So long, wow.
I know, it goes by fast. I just help to organize the volunteers and get the meetings set, the pre-event meeting and the post-event meeting. Primarily, I'm just kind of a middleman to help negotiate, keep all the people happy, and try to make the thing go as smoothly as possible.
And you also have conversations with the county about this place?
Yep, I kind of a liaison to the county parks department and try to put best foot forward for the organization and make sure that everybody's looking out for Neal's legacy and for the museum and what we're trying to protect here.
Okay. Well, what is it about the place that keeps you coming back?
Well, on a personal level, I love this place. It's always felt very connected spiritually to me, and I was never really involved in the whole Crimson Dawn Association up until that frantic phone call 14 years ago. But I've always loved this place, and I like the story. It's fun, and a lot of the people that are involved in this are just my kind of crazy. So I love it, and I enjoy the people mostly, and just being part of a fun activity that really stands out and makes this place and Casper a little different than most places you go.
Well, and this is a 90-year-old event that you're part of and keeping it going.
Keep trying.
Yeah.
Keep after it.
Yeah, and unlike most people who come as kids and then they bring their kids and they bring their kids, your kids brought you.
Yeah, in a manner, yes.
Yeah.
And, they were involved for a couple of years as Root, Branch, and Twig, and I've tried to get them back involved with it in other aspects, and they usually come and walk the tour. So they have a lot of fun with it. They dress up crazy costumes and just have a blast.
Well, this is a family festival. People don't always understand that it is for the kids and it is for families. And
It's very kid-oriented.
I mean, how many 90-year-old family storytelling festivals do you know about there?
This is it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been an honor and a privilege to be part of it, and I enjoy it thoroughly.
Well, as long as we're talking, why don't you stay here with me and we will virtually walk to the last point of this story. So we're going to turn our backs on the graveyard. We're going to look, and there you can see a circular area where there's wood, and there's somebody standing by ready, unless of course it's a very windy day and then they don't let us do it. And as we all come forward, they're lighting the bonfire. And pretty soon you have this big, magnificent bonfire. And all the witches have come from their shrines, and they're there, and Casper Mountain Fire is there, just in case. And as I told people earlier, everyone has the opportunity to pick up a handful of red dirt. And we're going to throw it into the bonfire and make a wish. Do you have a wish you want to make? Say maybe this time for Crimson Dawn and Midsummer's Eve?
My wish would be for safety, and my wish would be for us to be able to continue this for another 90 years.
Okay. Well, at that point, what we do is we walk back down the butte on the little trail that's there, and people leave to where they've parked. They stand and visit friends or sit and visit friends. They have coffee and cocoa and cookies at the cabin. And then I will come in and sit, and children will come in and talk to me, and if they bring a rock or something, I'll tell their fortune. And we have another Midsummer's Eve that has come to a close. Now that I've told you all of the stories of Midsummer's Eve and Neal's characters and all, I want to tell you a little bit more about Crimson Dawn. Neal actually donated this land to the county in the 1970s, and she actually received one of the first, Outdoor Recreation Achievement Awards from the Department of the Interior for this donation, because she donated it as an open space park. And there were a couple of conditions to that. One was that it would remain an open space park, it would not be developed. They would keep the house as a museum, talking about her life and her work. And the county would always create, on June 21st, a Midsummer's Eve celebration. A group of mountain residents and others in the 1950s started the Crimson Dawn Association, which is actually in charge of putting on the June 21st celebration. And so really this place up here is a collaboration between the Trona County Parks Department and the Crimson Dawn Association. There is one interesting piece of this. In her will, she said that if the county ever stopped doing Midsummer's Eve, then the land would go back to her family. Now, to make this all possible, we have a number of people who come and volunteer every year to play the parts of the characters, to be the sound crew, to make coffee. Bob Shepard and his folks have made coffee and cocoa for years for us. We have a board for the association that helps pull everything together. But just a few minutes ago you met Phil Pike, who's president of the association. But as he said, he got his start as a main character in the tradition. I personally have been coming to Crimson Dawn to Midsummer's Eve since I was 10 months old, and probably played my first character when I was in my 20s. So there's a lot of people who've been involved. I've been the storyteller now since 1991. If you want to know more about Neal and Crimson Dawn and Midsummer's Eve, we have 3 publications for sale here at the museum. Museum, by the way, is open from June 15th to September 15th every year. And we have a documentary that was produced in 2008. We have a book that Neal wrote in the 1960s, a fictionalized account of her life up here. And then we have copies of her Winter on a Mountaintop article that she originally wrote for the American Mercury magazine. So you can always come up here and visit the museum weekends between June and September, and walk the grounds, read the signs at the shrine, and just enjoy the beauty that is Casper Mountain and Crimson Dawn.